We need to learn not only when and when not to form concepts, but above all, once they are formed, how to use concepts properly in the quest for knowledge. That is how Leonard Peikoff concluded the last section in the reading. I'm Cody Leibold, and you're listening to the 11th meeting of the Objectivism Book Study. This week we're discussing pages 110 to 116 and about one page more in Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. Please give this a share wherever you are accessing it. That helps us reach more people. You can register to join upcoming discussions or to find all the replays at christianintellectual.com/objectivism. The main question for the reading this week was, how do we know what concepts are? Or now that we know what concepts are, what are the principles for forming concepts? The rest of this book amounts to the answer to that question. But these next sections are going to deal with the purely epistemological foundations to that issue. And I want to give you a lay of the land of what's coming. The rest of this book is going to be dealing with the kind of question of how do you form concepts about man, concepts about human relationships, about government, about art. These are the topics that belong within pure philosophy. Philosophers generally agree that there are 5 branches of pure philosophy. They would be metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, political theory, and aesthetics. And then there's also such thing as applied philosophy. So we're going to move from this background work that we're building on today about what concepts are, the pure philosophy, and then we're going to get to applied philosophy, and that would be beyond what's in this book. But that's what's necessary for any other academic subject, such as the philosophy of history, or of law, science, business, journalism, medicine, Christian ministry, and so on. They all have a philosophy of. Those are the applied philosophies. But it all rests ultimately back on epistemology. An applied philosophy would be the connecting work between pure philosophy, such as what we're looking at today, and other subjects of human knowledge, which could range from any level of academic rigor to the more applied or professional studies. Any area of human specialization. All of it is going to rest on the kinds of logical foundations that we're setting up today as far as this concept of objectivity. And that's the chapter that we're looking at today, is objectivity. So you can understand that pure philosophy is an integrator of the subjects, and it is the foundation of each subject on which each subject must be developed. That's true even for something like biblical hermeneutics or systematic theology. You'll notice that at the beginning of a good systematic theology, there's going to be something called a prolegomena. That's the applied philosophy. That's the section that introduces the need for systematic theology. How do you introduce the need for it? Well, that's a philosophical question. And so this is why pure philosophy is the base as far as the logical hierarchy of knowledge. So philosophy is the subject that asks the most basic questions, the kinds of questions that have answers that ought to be discoverable by nearly any person at nearly any time in history. It's different from rocket science. It's different from medicine. It's the kind of thing that if you were Abraham, you could have thought through the questions that we're looking at today. Questions like, what is a word? What are we doing when we use words? Or what is logic? Or what does it mean to tell the truth and to not lie and to be consistent with yourself, which is the same thing. Philosophical knowledge is the basic knowledge on which other knowledge rests, if it is to be knowledge. In the way that objectivism views knowledge, here is the pattern. The academic subjects are going to depend on applied philosophy. Applied philosophy depends on pure philosophy, the 5 branches. Pure philosophy hinges mainly on ethics and epistemology, with metaphysics being understood as the introduction to epistemology. So before we can have a robust theory accounting for our ethical concepts, we need a robust theory accounting for concepts as such. In the past weeks, we've seen the theory, Ayn Rand's theory of concepts. We've also seen what concepts are. What remains is to lay out the principles for how to form, how to use concepts. And so we're going to need to understand 3 key ideas to do that. The first is objectivity. And then after that, it's going to be reason. And after that, we're going to look at man's nature, also known as anthropology. These are 3 topics that are covered in the next 3 chapters that we're looking at. These chapters make up a robust account, or they lead to a robust account of ethics. They're the precondition of that. And then more derivatively, that's going to be able to lead to, say, ethics of this or that, ethics of journalism, ethics of medicine, whatever it may be. So this chapter is entitled Objectivity, and Ayn Rand gives an important description of objectivity in her book, Intro to Objectivist Epistemology. I'm going to read that. It's from page 82. You may or may not have read this book. That's not necessary. But here is what she says. Objectivity begins with the realization that man, including every attribute and faculty, including his consciousness, is an entity of a specific nature who must act accordingly, that there is no escape from the law of identity, neither in the universe with that which he deals, nor in the workings of his own consciousness. And if he is to acquire knowledge of the first, he must discover the proper method of using the second, that there is no room for the arbitrary in any activity of man, least of all in his method of cognition. And just as he has learned to be guided by objective criteria in making his physical tools, so he must be guided by objective criteria in forming his tools of cognition, his concepts. Just as man's physical existence was liberated when he grasped the principle that nature to be commanded must be obeyed, so his consciousness will be liberated when he grasps that nature to be apprehended must be obeyed. That the rules of cognition must be derived from the nature of existence and the nature, the identity of his cognitive faculty. So objectivity is applying that Baconian principle to not just to the world outside of us, but also to the workings of our minds as we form concepts. So that is an important summary of what objectivity is about. If you were to think, what do we mean when we say objectivity or objective? The thing comes to mind is a scientist working in a lab who is making multiple experiments, and he's comparing, the control group to test A, and he's trying to figure out what caused what. And when he tries to come to a conclusion about what caused something, it's not his feelings that tell him whether he's right. I just have this hunch. You can use your hunches, your maybe unaccounted suspicions, even though if you can't demonstrate them, you want to test them out. But what he's seeking in the end is something that is independent from his hunches or from his whims or wishes. He wants to know that this is something that actually is in reality, that when this happens, this will lead to this effect. And it's demonstrable. It's the kind of thing that he writes a report of it and says, I did all these things. And then any other scientist could come and repeat this experiment. And if it's repeatable, that's a good sign. If it doesn't matter who did it, what country they were in, anybody could repeat this experiment and get the same result. Then we're dealing with something that is objective. That is, we're dealing with knowledge of reality. And when we speak of objectivity, we're not just saying we're dealing with reality, but we're also we're dealing with it in such a way that is suited to reality. So the procedure I just laid out, like writing out your experiment and giving people the directions on how you came to your conclusions, showing people the work, making everything capable of being measured, that is objectivity. In other words, it's an approach to knowledge where you are showing your work and you're making everything available to the other person to see. Now, if there were no other people, if it was just you, would you still need objectivity? The answer is yes. Objectivity is a concept that applies in both society and in your own mind. So there is such thing as objective journalism. That's a social thing. There's objectivity in communication. Objectivity in communication would mean I laid out the reasons for my conclusion so that you can evaluate it independently. But what about objectivity as applies to just the lone person? Like say you're a farmer and you're the only one on your farm and you have to make a decision about whether or not you think that there's this parasite or something and you're going to need to use some kind of treatment on your plants. If you are faced with that kind of problem, you need objectivity. Because objectivity is when you say, I'm going to conform to reality. It's a commitment in your mind, in your method of thought that says, even if I wish something were not true, I'm still going to look. That's objectivity. You could easily say, oh man, I don't want to go check. I'm afraid that my strawberries have this blight on them, but I don't want to look. You could follow your wishes and your whims and not look, or you could go and you could look. And if you look, then you're conforming your method of gaining knowledge to the facts of reality. You're being objective, and sometimes it hurts. Sometimes it's painful, but it's in the long range, it's going to benefit you to know what you're dealing with and then not turn a blind eye. So let's go in the reading in OPAR. We're going to look at page 110 to start with. Summarizing where we are, he writes, according to Objectivism, epistemology is necessary for practical purposes as a guide to man in the proper use of his conceptual faculty. We're ready to concretize this claim. We can now begin to identify the rules men must follow in their thinking if knowledge rather than error or delusion is the goal. So that sets the foundation for why we need objectivity. We don't want to delude ourselves. We don't want to be we don't want to be tricked. If you're ever trying to teach a kid or a teenager about the need for objectivity and the need for careful thinking methods, this is what I would say to them. You don't want to be tricked. You don't want somebody to play you. You need to know how you can tell the difference between what's true and what's false. So Peikoff goes on, these rules can be condensed into one general principle: thinking to be valid must adhere to reality. And he quotes from Dragnet, the motto of the reality-oriented thought is, just give us the facts, ma'am. So how does one reach just the facts? This entire question, how do we reach facts? That's the question of objectivity. When you grasp this concept, Peikoff writes, you will have an invaluable tool enabling you to assess and, if necessary, improve the quality of your own thinking. I'll take a pause there before we jump into the next page. Thoughts so far? Any points that anyone wants to make or questions?
I don't know if this is too abstract, but I was recently talking to someone who is sort of not really a nihilist exactly, but he was listening to somebody who was a nihilist. So he was kind of giving me those talking points. And it seems like there's a difference between nihilism here and what we're talking about, because I was trying to answer some of his talking points from the perspective of objectivism. And when we talk about objective reality, it's like the idea of just give us the facts. With epistemology, and this is kind of what you just said, it's a method of validation so that anybody can reach the same conclusion. But when it comes to something like nihilism, they might say that, okay, there's facts that exist, but there's no ultimate meaning. So there's a difference between nihilism and objective reality here, where it's like, just because there is such a thing as objective reality, or there is such a thing as facts that we can know, that doesn't translate to ultimate meaning, or that's not I guess an ace in the hole against nihilism, if that makes any sense.
I think nihilism or nihilism is a
Nihilism.
Nihilism is a moral concept. So yeah, if you can demonstrate that 2 + 2 = 4, you could still fall under that category of being a nihilist.
Yeah, I think I don't know if objectivism would ever counter nihilism in any respect. I don't think it counters it here. I don't know if if it does at any point, but
it's largely designed to be an answer to nihilism.
Objectivism?
Yeah, once we get into the sections on the nature of man and axiology, and then once we get into the applied ethical theory, which includes like the account of the virtues and value, yeah, it's designed to be a defense against nihilism, one of its major targets.
Yeah, I was struggling to apply what I've learned so far against those talking about. So sorry, that's a little bit of a segue, but I just wanted to get that clarification from you. Thanks.
Sure, that helps frame why this study of philosophy is even necessary. There's all kinds of lies in the culture today, and yeah, you have to have an explanation for what value is, and then for what virtues are, and for what should be the proper motivation. And that's where we're driving in Rand's theory. We're going to get to some amazing and unique ways of framing the topic of what does it mean to value something? What is a code of values? Why is a code of values a scientific demonstrable thing? Can we be objective in accounting for morality? That's going to be the payoff. And what we're doing right here is we're just filling up the cannon, so to speak. And as we demonstrate that concepts are objective, we're preparing to demonstrate that moral concepts are objective. Let's go to this top of page 111, concepts as objective. The concept of objective, which applies to a norm, it applies as a norm to all rational cognition, has its roots in the theory of concepts. Objectivity arises because concepts are formed by a specific process and as a result bear a specific kind of relationship to reality. Peikoff writes, concepts are a human method of integrating perceptual data. Skipping one sentence, concepts do not pertain to consciousness alone or to existence alone. They are products of a specific kind of relationship between the two. Abstractions are products of man's faculty of cognition. Skip a sentence, but a faculty of cognition is concerned to grasp reality and must therefore adhere to reality. Peikoff writes, there is a uniquely human contribution to the conceptual level of awareness, and if you skip down to the middle of that paragraph, a man must expend effort. Peikoff writes, he must struggle to relate, connect, process an ever-growing range of data, and he must learn to do it correctly. Further, in such processing, the basic method he uses, measurement omission, is dictated by the nature of his cognitive faculty, not by reality. The result is a human perspective on things. Now, when we say reality, we mean reality outside of the way that a human mind is constituted. The human mind is within reality, but we just make sure you understand what he means by not reality. It's not the apples that dictate how you must conceptualize apples. It's your mind that is perceiving the apples that is part of that's what we're trying to save. That's what we're trying to account for. The result is a human perspective on things, not a revelation of a special sort of entity or attribute intrinsic in the world apart from man. Take away the mechanism of human consciousness, and the realm of concepts, universals, abstractions is thereby erased. So here you can tell that he's distancing himself from the perspective of Aquinas or Aristotle, from the realists, or from Plato. The concretes that exist, the objects of perception, would still remain as concretes, but the perspective that regards them as units would be gone. Now, you think he's just pushed himself away from the realists, but in the next paragraph he pushes away from the nominalists as well. On the other hand, consciousness is the faculty of grasping that which is, and there is a metaphysical basis for concepts. Metaphysical basis. There is something the same in reality about the units. Now, in the discussion that we had in previous weeks about this question of nominalism, that's one thing that Jacob Brunton brought up. He says we have to maintain that there is something the same about the concepts. This apple, there's something the same about it, and that one. And so while the Aristotelian or the Thomist would say there's an essence to appleness, and that thing, it transcends just the objects. The objectivists are going to qualify that slightly and say we appreciate the intentions here, but we're going to say no, there is no appleness outside of the objects, but we are perceiving universally the qualities of the apples. We have the capacity to perceive universally. We don't say there are universals outside of the apples. We say we have the capacity to perceive universally, or conceive, perhaps. I'm not sure which word works there. Go to the top of page 112. Peikoff writes, we can integrate perceptual entities into a mental unit only because these entities actually possess the same characteristics. So in the discussion between me and Jacob, one point of disagreement has always been, do the similarities exist? And I think that this disagreement hinges on linguistics, because he would say the similarities exist in reality. And I would say the apples exist in reality and they exist similarly. That's about the only difference that we have there. This is probably just a terminological difference. I don't think that the similarities exist unless the apples exist. That's what I'm trying to say. So Peikoff writes, we can treat existence as the same in a specified respect only because they are the same in that respect. The concepts are condensations of data formed by a volitional process in accordance with a human method. A lot of this, has the potential to just go shooting, in one ear and out the other. I read very slowly when I am interacting with this material. Concepts are condensations of data formed by a volitional process in accordance with a human method. There's a lot packed into that sentence. One thing that you can see from there is, why did we have volition already in this book? Why did we discuss volition? Well, it's because you can't have concepts unless you've established volition. So he writes, concepts are condensations of data formed by a volitional process. Now, because of the fact that it's a volitional process, that means that it's not something that exists if there are no volitional beings. If the world was, just ants living on the earth and there were no people, there would be no concepts. These are tool that we construct. This is specific to our method. Go to the middle of that paragraph. He writes, man therefore cannot project the products of this method outward into reality apart from man, nor can he detach them from reality either. Such products represent a special kind of union. They represent reality as processed by a volitional human consciousness. This is the status that Ayn Rand describes as objective. So that's something that you need to understand, is that from this point on in the book, whenever they say that something is objective, what they mean is that it pertains to reality as perceived by the distinct conceptual human ability. So we're referring to reality as grasped by man, which this could be misleading if you don't know that that's what they mean. Because when somebody says objective, somebody might say, oh, you mean it exists whether or not there's human beings or not? No, that's not what we're saying. That may be a common assumption about what objective means, but that's not what we're saying. We're saying that the concept is derived from the human method of looking at reality. It's a mouthful, but you have to remember that that's really what we're meaning when we contrast, for example, the objective view to the subjectivist view or to the intrinsicist view. What we are saying is that we are maintaining the account that Rand has given of concepts as we look at this particular concept. Go to the bottom of page 112. Peikoff writes, but if someone asks where is a conceptual object, e.g. manness, Ayn Rand answers, such an object is neither, quote, in the world, nor, quote, in the eye of the beholder. You see, she's rejecting intrinsicism and subjectivism. Manness, or any other, quote, universal, she holds, is facts of the world. It is concretes, as reduced to a unit, not by the eye, but by the mind of a conceptual being. Top of page 113, essential is, the key thing within the definition. You could say that the essential quality of man would be that he is rational and that he's a creature. That would be the essence. But for the objectivists, they follow Thomas, they follow Aristotle in speaking of essentials, but they disagree with them on the metaphysical status of essentials. They write, essential is not a metaphysical, but an epistemological term. Essential designates characteristics that perform a certain function in connection with human conceptualization. Skip a sentence. Since the category of, quote, essence arises because of a need of man's consciousness, the, quote, essential in each context has to reflect the state of human knowledge. There's a saying within objectivism that's whenever you're trying to ground your concepts in reality, you need to ask yourself, what facts of reality give rise to the need for this concept? It's not just what facts gave rise to the concept. What facts of reality gave rise to the need for this concept? Unless you can account for the human need to differentiate things according to your scheme, then you've not yet made your scheme objective. This would perhaps be illustrated by asking yourself what counts as a sport versus what counts as just an activity. Sport and activity, these are human concepts, they're abstractions. What exists in reality is actually kids throwing a ball back and forth, or kids attempting to throw a ball into a hoop and counting how many times they can do it. And one of them would be an activity, one would be a sport. And where are you going to draw the line? Or said another way, how are we going to cut that chicken? Because there's reality, but we need to divide it up. So we want to cut the chicken at the joints. Where are the joints? How do we determine where the joints are? How do we distinguish between activity and sport? Those are the kinds of things that Rand's theory is seeking to address, and what she's pointing out is that you must ask yourself, why do we need to distinguish? Why do we need to distinguish? And so in the case of a sport, some of the features that might help us understand why we need to distinguish between these types of things is, well, activity is a general idea. That could include sports, but sports are a special kind of activity. And in this case, it's going to be something that has a victory condition. All sports, I would think, have a victory condition. And we have to distinguish between an activity like drawing that doesn't have a victory condition, or playing your violin, or rolling a ball back and forth just for fun, versus the kind of activity that does. Why should we have to distinguish that? Well, because that's going to determine how we use it. It's the kind of distinction that we don't just reach by intuition. It's a distinction that you can actually tie to the needs of human beings. There's a certain kind of activity that has a winner, and there's a certain kind that doesn't, and that's a key aspect of the experience. Nobody wins at a symphony. We all win at a symphony. But in a basketball game, one team wins and one team loses. And you can point to the fact that that's the essence of what we're doing. Part of the definition of a sport, for instance, is that we've chosen that we're going to call this person the winner and this person the second place, and so on. When you're looking at human activities, it's like the concept of marriage or the concept of legal justice. It's clear that there's a whole stream of human choices that went into forming that reality. Whereas with apples, there's no human choice that necessarily went into creating that reality. For some concepts, we must bring in volition. We're in the middle of page 113. We see that definitions are, scare quotes, empirical statements. And reality is the standard of what is essential. So we do reference reality to determine which things are essential, but essential is within a specific reference for human beings. Middle of this page, essences are products of a volitional relationship between existence and consciousness. They too, properly formed, are objective. But notice when he says that the essences are objective, he doesn't mean that they exist outside of human beings. He means that they exist as a human method. Remember, because I took the time to say, remember, when he says objective, he doesn't just mean facts outside of human beings. He means a method of human beings for understanding facts. So if he is going to say that essences are objective, then he's pulling away from what Aristotle or Aquinas would say about essences. Next paragraph, in the traditional Platonic and Aristotelian viewpoint, every entity must have an essence or definition. This is not true in the objectivist viewpoint. So there are things out there that we've never discovered that do not have an essence, because essence is only a term for what human beings determine about things. This is not true in the objectivist viewpoint. Well, let me just read on. You'll see what it's saying. Since the designation of essentials arises only as an aid to the conceptualizing process, it is inapplicable apart from that process. Concretes that have not been integrated into a concept have no, quote, essence. In these cases, there is no need or possibility of a definition. So he's saying that, like, let's say there was a species of aliens on Mars, and then there was another species of aliens on Mars. They currently have no definition, because there is no human being who has knowledge of these species. They have no definition. Now, as a Christian, we read that and we think, well, wait a minute, doesn't God have some kind of perspective on those things? Perhaps, and that's something that I'd want to discuss with Jacob. I think he may have good material on that, but we'll see if he's able to show up in the video today or in a future week. I'm sure he'll watch this video. So, bottom of page 113, this is how you know whether you need to have a concept of something. Rand points out it's mandatory to conceptualize certain types of concretes. That would include 4 things she gives. The perceptual concretes that we deal with every day, like apples. New discoveries in science. So, I don't know, like for instance, the idea of a magnetic field. We have to conceptualize that in order to create televisions or something like that. C, that would be new man-made objects which differ in their essential characteristics from previous known objects. Television is her example. And then D, complex human relationships. So she lists out, Rand lists out marriage, law, justice. Another one would be athletics. That's something that we have to have a concept for because of the kind of lives that we live. These 4 categories represent existence with which men have to deal constantly in many different contexts. And she explains that. Go to the top of page 114, next paragraph. It says, it is impermissible to integrate certain concretes into a concept because that would contradict rather than satisfy the requirements of cognition. So, for instance, if you tried to say that Adolf Hitler and Ayn Rand are both fascists, that would destroy the concept of fascism. And people have done that. They've said that, because Ayn Rand believes in having standards, and the fascists also believed in having standards, although their standards were entirely different from Ayn Rand. Since they're not relativists, they're fascists. That's like the essence of the argument. They've just lumped together every non-relativist and assigned them the quality of people that want to be totalitarian dictators and kill people and send them to gas chambers. So it's a concept that doesn't integrate, because it's simply not true. So that there are certain areas where we must conceptualize. There are certain areas where we must not conceptualize. That would be a false conceptualization. And then there are areas where there's the option. This is distinct in Ayn Rand. She gives us the option to conceptualize on some areas. So the bottom of page 114, a third possibility is recognized. In certain cases on the periphery of man's conceptual vocabulary, it is neither mandatory nor impermissible to form a concept, but optional. For example, a language may be rich in close synonyms, which denote subtly different shades of meaning. For instance, do we really need to have the concept of glad, happy, cheerful, lighthearted, joyful, joyous, ecstatic, and so on? Well, not every language needs to have all of those. This is something that was sort of mind-blowing for me as a kid when, I asked my mom, because we lived in Bolivia, and most people in Bolivia speak Spanish. And I asked my mom, how do you say hello? And it's hola, but there's other ways to say hello as well. And I wanted to know which one translates to which one. Like, we have 3 or 4 English words. Each one of them needs to have an exact equivalent to a Spanish word, right? And she says, no. I'm like, what? Because I didn't have Rand's theory of concepts. So go to the page 115. Such differences may have important literary implications. They determine the brevity and emotional eloquence with which one can communicate a given meaning, but they are cognitively and epistemologically insignificant. This brings us to the objectivist answer to the borderline case problem. I think Leonard Peikoff put in this issue here because it is most naturally related to the overall topics that we're discussing, but it could be a little bit of a bigger discussion. I think in other places, the objectivists have discussed this idea of the borderline problem. For instance, Isaac, could you come on camera for a second? Say hello. Oh, well, it's not showing you. Isaac has recently shaved his mustache. And I want to ask you, how long will it be until he has that mustache back? What's the definition of a mustache? Is it like 5 hairs? Is it 100? What if you only had like 15 little whiskers?
Depends on how large your lip is.
So there is certainly a borderline issue here, isn't there?
Yes.
And
indeed.
another philosophical problem that's related to that is like, how much is a pile of sand? Like if you had 3 pieces of sand, would that be a pile? No. But if you had 1,000,000 pieces of sand, that would clearly be a pile. Well, where do you distinguish between what's a pile and what's not? Or where do you distinguish between how tall a hill has to be before it's considered a mountain? These types of questions. What's the difference between a stream and a river? Clearly, there are bodies of water at every size. There are mustaches at every state of development. There are piles of sand or mountains at every state of development. So where's the, if we're going to try to cut the chicken at the joints, where's the joint? We have a problem. We don't have a joint. So at this point, we have options. This is the borderline problem. Now, people in the history of philosophy have tried to use the borderline problem in order to argue for subjectivism. Well, it's all just a matter of personal preference. But Rand is not doing that. Rand is saying there are some questions on which we have options, but she's also saying, but we can know which ones those are and which ones are not those. So precisely because of the borderline issues, you have several options in those. So at the bottom of page 115, the borderline case problem is no problem if one accepts an objective view of concepts and therefore of essences with the classificatory options that makes possible. I think that might be the first time I ever said that word out loud. Okay, conceptual options exist only when the facts of reality can be organized by men in different ways without this making any cognitive difference. or leading to a contradiction. So can we draw the line between a hill and a mountain at whatever point, and then can we just decide that we're going to follow that consistently? Sure. That's why we have surveyors. They're capable of making definitions that we can use. There are many situations like this where you have to create a definition for the sake of practicality. You must create one. All right, top of 116, we get into this next section, and this was not on the scheduled reading. I just wanted to read 1.5 extra pages because I knew that we were going to have a little extra time. The discussion was short today. We're looking at the next heading, Objectivity as Volitional Adherence to Reality by the Method of Logic. That is a mouthful. Objectivity as Volitional Adherence to Reality by the Method of Logic. So we'll dissect that. Different views of the nature of concepts lead to different views of the nature of cognition. They lead to different answers to the central question of epistemology: what is knowledge and how does man acquire it? The objective approach to concepts leads to the view that beyond the perceptual level, knowledge is the grasp of an object through an active, reality-based process chosen by the subject. So at the perceptual level, we just somewhat automatically, perhaps that's the right word, automatically, we look at something and our mind tells us, oh, that's a table, in the case of the paradigm that they use, or that's a house. We don't have to use our volitional capacities to immediately recall that integration. It's not a volitional thing. But when it comes to higher level things that are beyond the perceptual level, like for instance, victory or first place medal in a swimming match, when it comes to things like that, knowledge is the grasp of an object through an active, reality-based process chosen by the subject. There's the volition. Peikoff writes, human knowledge, therefore, is the grasp, not the creation of an object. We're grasping something, but we're doing it by the human method. Bottom of that paragraph, a method of cognition, a method that makes it possible for man's consciousness, when dealing with abstractions, to achieve by deliberate policy what is not guaranteed to it automatically, to remain in contact with the realm of reality, is what we need. So he's going to contrast two different approaches. One of these, I think, is consistent with what I hear from Cornelius Van Til, and one of them is consistent with what I hear from Timothy Keller. So that gives you an idea of where we're going. Peikoff writes, man does not need a method of cognition, mystics say, because on the most important matters he is incapable of error. If he turns his mind over to God, he is automatically right. That is the epistemological system of Cornelius Van Til. Next, he writes, man is not automatically right, skeptics say, so his conclusions are untrustworthy and cannot be discovered by any method. In this view, man is incapable of truth. That is the professed conviction of Timothy Keller. And not to say that Keller cannot also engage in mysticism and the other errors. The thing about mysticism is they'll often jump between those two. They'll jump from subjectivism, or they'll jump from the intrinsic view to the subjective or skeptic view, and then they'll jump back. So don't be surprised when you see that people that are capable of making big errors are capable of continuing in that. So top of page 117, man is not automatically right. Objectivism replies to both schools. And for this very reason, we must define a method of cognition, a method that will guide his mental processes properly and thereby make a fallible being capable of truth. For a volitional, conceptual consciousness, a method of knowing reality is both necessary and possible. To define such a method, Ayn Rand holds, is the purpose of epistemology. The method must reflect two factors, the facts of external reality and the nature of man's consciousness. And the last thing I'll read here is, to be objective, this is the middle of the page, to be objective in one's conceptual activities is volitionally to adhere to reality by following certain rules of method, a method based on facts and appropriate to man's form of cognition. This has been a lot of positioning this week, a lot of positioning of what is it going to mean when we say that something's objective. And this is where we'll stop, because we'll save some drama for next week. What do we actually do? But the answer is going to be, we follow logic. We integrate our observations in a way that never contradicts itself. In order to be honest, in order to be reality oriented, we must commit ourselves to this policy where when I affirm X, I don't in the next sentence affirm non-X. In the past, I tried to explain, what is logic to people that didn't really understand what it was or why we need it. I remember a friend of mine, we were sitting eating together, and he said, so what is logic? Is it just saying something like, well, A is true, so A therefore not B? And I said, no. Logic is remembering that if you're going to say that A is true, then it's A therefore not A. It's so easy. It's just don't make yourself a liar. That's what logic is. Don't make yourself a liar. Aristotle points this out. The simplest thing that anybody could say is we must not affirm and deny at the same time in the same sense. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I always understand logic as, I guess, the law of non-contradiction. And whenever I have, this is like sort of an off comment, but whenever I have a word that I don't know the definition of, like logic or values, I always go to Ayn Rand. Like I forget what website it is, but it's you can search words and you'll have like lots of things that come up from her various writings. And I'll just read through as many come up of
You're thinking
things
of
that
the
she's.
Ayn Rand lexicon.
Thank you. Exactly. She writes such great definitions of words, and sometimes it doesn't always get me there. Sometimes I need to do a little bit more research, but it's such a great starting point. I remember reading the definition of values and the definition of logic from her, and it's been so helpful.
Excellent. Further comments before we move to the next section? All right. Well, I know that we've got to the end of the reading for this week, and so if anyone would like, we can discuss further issues, clarification points, or material from past weeks, because I'd go another 5 or 10 minutes if you guys are interested. One of the main unanswered issues that we've sort of raised is this question of, well, how do we know whether realism is correct, like Aristotelian realism? And I want to be fair to that position, and I want to make sure that anybody that watches this in the future can evaluate objectively. I want to communicate objectively, and I want to give them the chance to be able to say, well, what are the reasons for and against, and evaluate it with their own mind. And my position is that the objectivists are right, but that in order to have a robust Christian approach to this issue, we're going to also have to answer the question, what is it? How does God's knowledge relate to all this? That's something that I'm interested in learning more about, and I don't have a strong position on at this moment, other than to say that God's means of knowing things is totally different from ours. God doesn't learn, and so when we speak of concepts as objective and as existing within a specific human context, and that context develops over time, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with how God knows things. Plato would have imagined that God knows things by that he knows things, and that he knows them in some perfect way, where there's never anything that's ever been learned. It's always been known from the beginning, and that human beings sort of come to remember that from a past life. That's his way of characterizing the issue. And Aristotle's different, but somewhat influenced by Plato. And Rand is quite different from that. She points out that the idea of a universal, that's just something within the human method of gaining knowledge. And she would maintain, and Peikoff would maintain, the universals are not a metaphysical thing. It's just human beings understanding things universally by a method. And you get to the question of, well, how do you, from the fact that you've established that we conceptualize in a certain way, how do you then go and say metaphysical universals don't exist, or metaphysical essences don't exist? How can you say that something doesn't exist? And Rand's answer to that would simply be to say the onus is on the one who asserts the positive. You have to show some reason to think that it exists, and we haven't seen it, so therefore we're not going to say it exists. And that's as far as we go. But that said, that's an open challenge to anyone who does affirm metaphysical status of universals or of essences. And Jacob might. I think Jacob would. He would say that similarities exist in reality, and that's realism. I tend to think that our disagreements hinge on what do we mean when we say real. What do we mean when we say that something is metaphysical? It's not that we disagree about how we should be thinking about things. It's perhaps we disagree about how we should be thinking about terms. But that is what philosophy does. It gives us the definition of definition, the concept of concept. It helps us be objective about objectivity. It helps us be rational about what reason is. And that's why it is so much work. And that's why it's not been done in the past very effectively, because it takes a unique mind to be able to sit down and ask yourself the dumbest questions, the smallest questions. What does it mean when I say that something means something? How do I know that I know something? These are not the questions that most people occupy their time with. It takes a specific personality to do it. But once it's been done, other people don't have that same bent can benefit from it.
A comment on that. I don't know if you shared it or who it was. I think it was somebody in our circle. It was the story about what Abraham Lincoln said about the dog with the legs. He posed the question to the crowd and he said, if you count the tail as a leg, how many legs does a dog have? And the crowd answered 5. And Abraham Lincoln said, no, a dog has 4 legs. Just because you count the tail as a leg doesn't mean that a dog has 5 legs. And I did that experiment with my wife and my dad, and it was fun. But I was thinking to myself about it, and I'm like, I can imagine if I did that experiment with somebody else, a specific kind of person, the kind of response I'd get from them would be like, that's so dumb. That's the dumbest thing. And as I'm thinking about that, I'm like, this experiment, like, leave out the part that Abraham Lincoln said it, because that's just going to bias someone. Once you tell somebody that, they're going to be like, oh, this has to be smart. Leave out the part about Abraham Lincoln, just do the experiment with them. And I think a lot of people might respond, that's so dumb. Because there's some element to that where if you're not a thinking person, you won't see how that's profound. You'll just see, like, you told me to treat the tail as a leg, and now you're telling me, and now you're contradicting yourself. No, we're making a profound point here. The point is that you should be an independent thinker for yourself. When would anybody ever treat a tail as a leg? That doesn't make any sense. A dog has 4 legs, regardless of how you decide to pretend things are differently than how they actually are.
I had a friend once who was asking, why this, why that, in a Bible study. And then one of my other friends said, hey, I have a question. Why ask why? And he says, yes, that's my new motto. I think whenever people start asking too many questions, I'm just going to say, why ask why? I mean, he's being ironic, but he actually was being incoherent because he's deprecating the quest for knowledge, but he's doing it by using the same process, which is asking why. I think that there are people who ask why, and there are people who give blank stares when you ask why because they haven't yet awakened to the value. I think that as Christians trying to be salt and light within our own churches, we need to be attentive to the fact that most people have not been awakened to the beauty of the pursuit of truth. Even though they have been given truth, they've been given it in a way that taught them that there was nothing particularly necessary for them to do, and that there was nothing particularly at stake if they didn't do a good job of it. And that's what we're fighting against. That's why we have our website, christianintellectual.com. We're trying to show people that they must develop the capacity to care about the truth and to seek it self-interestedly. That's what we do. Well, I'll wrap up our meeting for this week. Thank you, everybody that has been watching, and please give it a like and share wherever you're watching it. You can always join us. Go to christianintellectual.com/objectivism. We meet 9 a.m. to about 10 a.m. Eastern Time. on Saturday mornings. You can get on our update list at christianintellectual.com/subscribe, and also at that /objectivism link, you can find replays of past weeks. Make sure you're following us on all the channels, and make sure that you're helping us get more reach by sharing it every once in a while or clicking like or commenting, because that's how this message gets to more people. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll see you next time. God bless.